We are here obviously to talk about building an ethical supply chain and labor in particular. So we just wanted to start, I think, picking up on what the last session was just talking about. I'd love to ask you both, why do you think it is that we don't talk about the S in ESG quite as much as the E?
Yeah, thanks, Meg. What I find is it really has to do with the fact that we don't have the right language and that we're scared of talking about the S in ESG. So when we talk about the S in ESG and I read reports from investors, from other people, we see such a wide range of things that people are trying to do. Like they might be endowing a professorship or they might be feeding, hungry children food. But the fact of the matter is our first responsibility as companies our first social responsibility is to the people in our value chain, upstream and downstream. And we need to focus on that. There's no such thing as net zero when it comes to the S in social sustainability. You can't have forced labor in your supply chain and then offset it with a professorship at Stanford, right? That doesn't work. We actually have to take on these issues. And so I think boards and CEOs need language to talk about how complex this issue is and to break it into pieces and decide where in their value chain, whether it's in the upstream, so their supply chain where Laura works, or it's in their downstream in marketing or delivery or even disposal, that they need to spend their energy figuring out what to do about people.
Yeah, 100% agree with you, Elena. Bata, it's really about how we define the S. And is it our workers? Is it the community? Is it the school teachers that work in our community, and really looking at it that level? Also further defining the workers, is it the blue collar worker that is in our in-house manufacturing units, or is it the office worker, or is it somebody working more in a global role? And really, what are their needs and what are their drivers, and how they are giving back to the company as well as to the community in which we are operating in. Before we really sit down and address the E, we really need to look at who is the S and how we are defining the S. And Bata as a global organization, I know many people think Bata is more local, but we are in 71 different countries with 21 of our own in-house manufacturing units around the world. And how we define the S within our organization does vary by region and even by our operating countries where we're operating, because we have to look at the needs that are relevant for that area where we're operating. So how we work with a worker in our manufacturing facility in one region or one country may vary, because there could be a shortage of water in that area, or in another area there could be not enough water. So we really have to evaluate the impact that we're having on the worker, and then how they extend that out into the community.
So I'm going to kick us off next with our first live poll of the day. Just a reminder to respond to our live polls. You can just scan the QR code on the back of your badge to put your response there. So the first question is, what is your company's primary motivator for addressing human rights issues in your supply chain? So the responses for that are, is it financial companies and investors, or is it more driven by the new regulations that are coming from all of the different countries? So I'll start with you. What would you both say your response is?
Well, I think this is really exciting time to be in this space, because finally regulators are catching up, and so are financial institutions. So I've been working in human rights for over a decade now, and this is the first year where I'm advising PE firms, where I am advising real financial institutions who have power over how do we talk about human rights? How do we make sure that we're not only doing value protection, but we're also doing value maximizing? So how do we go beyond just making sure there's not forced labor, but making sure that we're doing good things? And part of that is coming from the fact that there are these incredibly big laws that are coming out around the world. We kind of divide them into 4 different types. So the ones that have been around for a long time are disclosure laws, simply saying that you just have to say you don't have forced labor in your supply chain. The second one is what we see happening in the US, where Customs and Border Control is saying if you have any product that is made by a Uyghur or that might have Uyghur slave labor within its supply chain, then we won't let it in our borders. This model is a guilty until proven innocent model. So what we see happening is that containers are being stopped at the border pretty randomly and seizing products, right? Until the company can prove that there was no forced labor, and not just forced labor, but specifically Uyghur forced labor in the manufacturing of that product. And so let me tell you, this is getting boards' attentions, right? When you have millions and millions of dollars of product held up at a port, you can't sell it, you can't do anything with it, they're paying attention. The second thing that we see happening is coming out of Europe, where we see these new human rights due diligence laws that are basically saying you are responsible as a company to any harm done to humans or the environment within your supply chain in the making of your product. These laws are insanely mammoth, right? They're very, very big. They're far-reaching. They have lots of different requirements. And so this is a more innocent until proven guilty model, but we're going to have to see over time what happens with case law, and so how people are going to react to it. And so right now, from my perspective, I see most European companies really seized by trying to figure out what these laws mean to them and how they're going to act. And then the final kind of set of laws that we see are the greenwashing laws. So these are laws that are basically saying you can't market and tell people that you're doing education if you're not actually. And so we're seeing this really change the way that people speak about the social sustainability that they have within their supply chain. And the Dutch are kind of really pushing that one home right now. So you might be seeing a lot of headlines around that. So the point is that boardrooms are finally paying attention, right? So I think regulations are pushing it, but financial and investors are kind of reacting to that regulation, right? Because it's now value protection, right? I can't invest in you if you have forced labor in your supply chain because you're not going to be able to get your product out. You're not going to be able to do X, Y, and Z. But
absolutely, I definitely. One of the big things of primary motivator is it's what the government is putting out there and what's there, the compliance side of it. But really, what we're trying to do is it's not just about the compliance. It used to be about I want to move beyond compliance and demonstrate continuous improvement within my global supply chain. Now it's moving beyond continuous improvement to demonstrate due diligence. So what you have to be compliant to the regulators. Now financial companies and investors want companies, public and private, to start to raise the bar and practice that due diligence, and what mechanisms do they have in place for those due diligence. And that for many companies is a big ask. And we have to face into that this is coming. And really moving forward, the boards are asking for it, and ultimately the consumers are assuming that that's already happening. It's amazing how many consumers are not, they assume that it's already there, that level of due diligence, and it's still coming. We have to link the financials in with the sustainability agenda. This has been something that has been being addressed for the better part of 10 to 15 years. We don't need sustainability as a standalone. It needs to be incorporated into every activity that an organization, a company is doing.
So let's see what you all think. If we could see our poll results from the poll. I can see them before you guys. Yeah, so it looks like most of you believe financial companies and investors are really driving the change. I am curious if after hearing the answers, if you feel like regulation, maybe, I feel like regulation is a big one, but to your point, I feel like I should have had a both response on here because they're kind of working together.
Well, you know, like I said, I've been doing some advisory work for PE firms, and I've been reading all of these sustainability reports, right? And when we look at the E, you know, there is such an incredible narrative that we see happening across all portfolios, right? And many companies. Everybody's talking about carbon emissions, and it's really clear, and every famous CEO you know out there has some E project, right? So everybody's excited about it. And I think we just don't yet have the words to talk about the S in a way that can get boards excited about it. And that's why the regulation part is so important, because now it's like, this is the baseline, this is what we expect. You know, we're not gonna have CEOs walking out and being like, woohoo, we finally don't have forced labor in our supply chain, right? Like that's probably not something they can ever actually say with full confidence, but B, definitely not something they want to admit that they haven't been doing. To Laura's point, this is something we all expect already happens. So I think it's a combination, and it's making sure that we really have good narratives and making sure that we know where is our biggest impact, right? And For tech companies, that's probably going to be in your downstream and how it's used, right? How is your product used? Is that causing harm? For apparel and footwear and electronics companies, that's really going to be around who's making your product. Where did your product come from? What materials were used in getting that product, right? We know cobalt is a huge issue, right? A huge risk point. And so these regulations are now saying it doesn't matter if you don't know. You have to do something about it. You have to be responsible for your actions. So I think this is an exciting time to be in the industry.
Yeah, absolutely. And part of the value chain is when you look down the downstream at the manufacturing side. At Bata, we're also a manufacturer, but we're also a brand retailer. We have our own stores around the world. And it's also how we're looking at the value stream upstream. You know, it's how we're working with our logistics partners. How do we get that product from a manufacturing facility to port, from port of landing to the retail stores, right? All of that S in the middle as well is definitely important, and that impact of that S on the environment is equally important. We have to keep this in mind that the person that is driving the truck, you know, are they using an engine or an electrical vehicle, as we heard in the last session? You know, we also they're the one who either can make that decision and make that impact, whether they're a freelancer or a part of a company, and they can impact that. So it's not only just downstream, but it's also upstream in our value stream.
Yeah, I think it's the question we're asking is everyone in your value chain treated with fairness and respect?
Yeah.
And that starts at home, right? You can't look at your suppliers and say, you need to treat your employees better if you aren't looking inwardly first, right? And you aren't, so it's in the same way that we're using the examples in carbon or in the environmental side to say, look what we're doing, we have to do the same thing when it comes to employment, right? When it comes to who are our workers, how are we treating them? What is fairness? What is respect? Do they have overtime, right? Yeah. Are they paid fairly? Are they paid competitively? You know, what are the things that we're thinking about to make sure we're not causing harms to humans?
So that leads me kind of to obviously the regulations and the financial impact of where the change is starting to come from. Data is the important piece, collecting the data and starting to have measurable data. And I know that, as you mentioned, just because we don't have the same kind of metrics to measure in the E side, it can be a little bit more difficult. Laura, why don't we start with you? I know, where are you really on this data collection journey in response to the regulations and the financial impact?
Yeah. So Bata, we're a 100-year-old plus company. We have loads of data. Where we are in the journey is how do we take the data points and link them in together and make that data readable and usable. I think many of us in our roles, many companies, reading data and understanding data is a completely new skill set that possibly didn't exist 20, 15 years ago as it does today. So we're very much at taking the data that we have and how do we use that? How do we read that? How do we take that to make an impact? How do we use that financial data? How do we use our labor statistics and our labor data very much around how we're working in the voices of our workers, whether they're coming at different stages of our own values change or our supplier value change. We're measuring things related to labor standards, working conditions. We're looking at things like energy, water, and waste. Wastewater as well is in there. We're measuring our chemical use. We're measuring, and when we review those as well, we're trying to identify where we can improve, where we can maybe take something out and substitute it to make a practice or a tangible, like for example, a chemical or a material, substitute it with something that will have a better impact for the environment and measure that. And we really tend to not go from 0 to 100 overnight. I think many companies prefer to start small and grow, and that's really the approach that we're taking, that we start small, we learn from that experience, and then we look to bring that out globally for a bigger impact.
And for you, where you obviously are working with clients and companies to help them figure out how to start their data journey. What's kind of the first steps that you take with a company?
Yeah, so again, I think first it starts with thinking about what data you want to collect and how is that important. And I think the scale that we're talking about is so big, right? We're talking about, in some, you look at Pepsi supply chain, right? Pepsi has, I think, they impact something like 800,000 people, right? Like, so how are we breaking this data down in tangible pieces that we can make change and actually know where the problems are? And so what we do with companies is we first talk about our own responsibility and then empowering our suppliers throughout the supply chain to take responsibility for their employees as well. And what we want to make sure that is happening is that there are systems. So we're not out there looking and making sure and seeing if there are issues. So for example, my assumption is that there's sexual harassment happening in almost every company in the world, right? The problem isn't the sexual harassment. The problem is, do we have the system to catch it, to remediate it, and to make change based on, when we find out that it happens, right? Do workers have voices to do that? And so what we do is we help companies first break it down, and then second, work with workers to listen to workers to understand what problems they're facing, and if they feel like their company is responsive to those problems. So I think, one of the biggest numbers that we use throughout everything we do is an eNPS, an Employee Net Promoter Score. Would you recommend this as a place of work to a friend or family member? So to me, that's a really comparable number. It's great. It works in like so many different kinds of contexts that we can use that number to tell our workers being treated with fairness, right? Yes, they may have a complaint, but do they trust and believe that that complaint is going to be addressed? That's what we care about. And so we help companies, big consumer brands, go to their suppliers, make sure that their suppliers have all of the correct human resources tools to ensure that their workers are able to do these things. And then we collect eNPS, make sure all workers have been educated about their rights and responsibilities. We make sure workers have access to grievance mechanisms. We ask questions like, do you feel safe at work? These are really great questions to help us understand what the worker experience is and if there are risks that maybe we don't see. Because a lot of these things that are happening that are bad are kind of not necessarily out in the open, right? They may be happening behind closed doors, or they may not be, like an audit isn't gonna find some of these issues. Audits look for things that happened in the past, right? They aren't very good at predictive things. So we're helping companies by collecting data, speaking with workers directly, and then making sure that we segment that data based on suppliers and where it falls within your supply chain so that we know where the risks are and we know how to help them and improve it long term.
Yeah, absolutely. I 100%, listening to the workers. And when you mentioned, Elena, around, audits are looking at what's happening. It's a bit reactive. And, we want to be a lot more predictive in that. And how do we become a bit more proactive? And workers who are doing those jobs every single day, they do have a vision and a direction of what they're working on and how they want to see it go forward.
First line of defense.
Yeah, absolutely. And whether it be related to grievance mechanisms and on how to improve a grievance mechanism, or, different ideas on how to bring camaraderie around the workforce, or to unify people around even worker safety. But some of the best initiatives, and also to tie the S to the E, is some of the best initiatives within Bata are coming from our workers in our own supply chain. And what we have a couple of years ago, we had a production engineer say, hey, I want to do solar. I'm responsible for all the electricity in this facility, and I want to do solar. And guess what? That project today is very successful, and that solar power we now feed back into the grid. And it's also about forced labor. It's also about listening to the worker. When you listen to your worker, you also can tie things into other areas, such as the E.
Yeah, and that's a fact, right? We've seen, I don't need to sit here and tell you this, right? I'm sure you guys know higher eNPSs have bigger returns on your bottom line, right? We know that when we listen to workers that they're more productive, they're less likely to be absent, they're more likely to deal with their health issues, they're more likely to be collaborative, right? So yes, the first place is dignity of work, right? Protection of rights. But then once we do that, we can go to engagement, right? We can go to value add. How do we leverage our workers to make our companies even better than what we imagined, right? How do we use our workers as part of our systems of innovation?
Absolutely.
And that ultimately is, think about it for, I'm sure many people in this room, work is where you spend most of your time, right? And so you want to be happy there. You want to feel like if you're not being treated with respect and kindness or engagement, man, not a great, life to live. It's a horrible existence. And so I think paying attention to that is really important to solving this problem and to increasing your bottom line ultimately.
I'm going to work in a couple of, since we're getting to the end of our session already, man, too fast. I wanted to just ask a couple of audience questions, and then I have one last question for myself. Do you make your ESG data public and available for your investors?
This is a great question, and ironically, I just had this conversation last week. So this is something we are gathering. We do make the data available. So at Bata, we are not publicly listed on multiple stock exchange. We are publicly listed on a few of the Asian stock exchange, where we do at this stage provide that stock exchange and those investors that data. We are working internally, as I mentioned earlier, to synthesize that and to bring things forward. And that's really, I've been at Bata for just over a year now, and that's been a big part of the last 12, almost 13 months of my job, is to understand what's there, and then now let's use it, and let's start to communicate it, and let's start to use it for predicting and driving things forward for an impact.
So a question playing devil's advocate here. They say, at the end of the day, the higher cost of any sustainability initiatives, are they passed down to the consumers? What do you think?
Yes and no. I mean, that's why it's really important that we have regulations involved, right? Regulations level the playing field. If nobody can have forced labor in their supply chain, then all prices are rising, right? It's the same competitive market. So I think that's definitely part of it. But again, as we said, like almost all of the work that we do around human rights, we can also show that it increases your bottom line. Yes, at the end of the day, probably if you don't pay people to work, then it probably is cheaper for you long term. But is that the right thing to do, right? Is that the only thing that you can do? And we see that when we do start to pay people and we do start to engage them, that there are other benefits that happen to our company.
Any thoughts to add on that one?
No, not really. I definitely align with Elena. Where you're definitely going to see everything is going to be in the bottom line. Of course, you have to make some investment up front before you start to see that in the bottom line, and you need to start to streamline your employees and start to collect that data and read it and understand what it means. So absolutely agree.
Great. So my last question to you both is going back to the regulation and the data piece all combined. Mm-hmm. There are so many different regulations that ask for so many different things. For these companies in this audience, what do you recommend that they start, and where can they start on their journey to try to address all of these new challenges coming from the regulatory market?
Yeah, I think number one, first and foremost, almost all of these laws are actually based on the UN guiding principles for business and human rights. So get educated, right? They're all based on the same core principles. And so, I think first and foremost is educating yourself, your team, and your suppliers. And that's a really easy, low bar to do, right? The second thing is to, at the very minimum, set up a grievance mechanism for workers within your entire supply chain, right? They have to have a way to talk to you. Now, I can talk for ages about what doesn't work about grievance mechanisms, but it is a baseline. You have to do it. Yeah. It's a non-negotiable. So I think those are the two places to get started. And then I think start thinking about how your human resources and what you know as a human resources company or what your human resources team is doing, how can that help your suppliers, right? What can you do? And then finally, I think you're gonna have to focus, right? You have to focus. Your supply chain is so big, upstream and downstream and everything. So where do you have the most impact? Where is your biggest impact? And that's really where you should put the most energy.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And just to add to that, one of the other things too is you have to have partnerships, external partnerships, multi-stakeholder partnerships, whether it be with bilateral organizations, NGOs, local community organizations. These are very important, especially when you're working with your workers and they're raising something that they either want to do or a grievance, how you react to that. It's not about knowing everything 100% internally yourself within your organization, but really through those partnerships and those organizations that have a Charter House rules type of approach really can help you bring everything together and also help you to understand where you are in your journey and how you are comparing to other people, because competition can also be healthy.
Yeah, you can't do it alone. And there's experts that have been working on this for a really long time and have learned a lot about it. So ask for help.